Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here, in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Jake Friedman.
I'm Brendan Hansen.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And today's episode is a deep dive on Architects of the West Kingdom, a Shem Phillips and S.J. McDonald game from Garphill Games, released in 2018. This episode should be kind of a return to form for people who have been missing our deep dive episodes.
They said the deep dives were dead.
What does dead but never die? I'm excited to just kind of dive deep on a game, to really explore the decision space of, I would say, a celebrated Euro game from the past 5 or so years that I think is known mostly as sort of an entryway game that people are really drawn to for a unique feel and mix of mechanisms while still having the sort of bread and butter worker placement game going on that makes for such an easy way to jump in and explore a game. So I'm pumped, Jake. More Garphill games. It's been a long time. The last game we covered of theirs was Raiders of the North Sea. Maybe another really good jumping in point, actually, to the style of
I think there's a lot of corollaries between the two. But I have a really important question, Brendan. You're saying Garphill?
Garphill.
Are you pretty confident it's not Garphill?
Oh my gosh.
I don't know.
I think it's Garphill.
All right, no. I'm just saying. I don't know.
Let us know what the pronunciation is.
We'll commit. Let's commit. Garphill.
That's what I think it is.
Okay.
Jake told me before the show started also that we had a new review. I have not read the review, except for the title, which is Game Design Masterclass. So I'm going to read that to you now because Jake and I always love when we see reviews of Decision Space go on Apple Podcasts or anywhere else on the internet. And as a way of showing our appreciation, we like to read those reviews on air. So thank you to Winger Design for leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. And without further ado, here's the review. Again, sight unseen by me. Decision Space is in a league of their own. Most board game podcasts cover the overall feel of a game, and a few dive into specific elements and game mechanisms. Jake and Brendan take it even further and analyze the game design and its impact on the players, their decisions, interactions, agency within the game systems, and the overall user journey. Their thoughtful breakdowns and reviews are a great source for learning about game design and the nuances of the decision spaces it creates for the players. Thank you so much, Winger Design. I really appreciate that. I think this is sort of an unforeseen consequence that Jake and I have sort of created with the format of the show, is that tons of people who are interested in design, like Jake and I, are drawn to these episodes because these episodes kind of like allow us to peel back the I don't know, our brain flaps, our cranial flaps, so people can just get right in there and see the experience of ours playing the game, what we think about in a way that maybe you don't always get when you're just playing through a game yourself or sitting at the table. So I'm really glad that it's drawn that part of the audience and not just fans of the game in general.
Yeah, peel back the old brain flaps. A very normal and cool metaphor by my co-host Brendan Hansen. Yes, I would say that is a 10 out of 10 review.
Good job reviewing the review.
I'm not crying. You're crying listening to that.
It's sweat.
Okay.
Just kidding.
Okay, so thank you so much for that great review. If you want to help us out, the best way you can do that is leave a review of the show on iTunes or Podcast Addict or wherever you're listening to this show right now. Brendan, without further ado, why don't we get into our ratings and reviews of Architects of the West Kingdom.
I'm Jaking it today. I did not prepare something, so I'm speaking off the cuff. And I'm just going to use this to reflect on my journey with Architects before I give my score. So that's that. Jake, this game came to Board Game Arena. I was really excited to try it because of its reputation and because I liked Raiders of the North Sea. The first couple of plays of it did not pop for me at all. I was sort of like, I don't get it. I'm not understanding the appeal at all. But you and I stuck with it. We started with a multiplayer game. It was 4 players and kind of just didn't click. And the more we played 2-player games, the more I started to see the appeal that this is a game about pacing, it's a game about timing, and it's a game about understanding the flow of the game so you can end your pursuit of resources and converting those resources just ahead of your opponents. And it's also about action sequencing. So the more I played it, the more I've really come to enjoy it. I think this is a comfort game. It's not one where the decisions seem tremendously interesting or the design itself really pops and feels novel. But at the end of the day, it's fun and it offers consistently variable and dynamic decisions that kind of challenge you to chart a different path every time you play based on a few different factors that we'll get into in the review. Playing this game has also made me realize maybe that the Garfield games in general are sort of like the Call of Duty of board games in a way. They all kind of have a similar feel, a similar
Oh,
broad audience appeal that maybe scratch an itch it's hard to get elsewhere. They're fun, they're kind of raucous. Maybe they're not the deepest, but they're really enjoyable. So at the end of the day, this isn't one of my favorite games, but I find myself liking Architects of the West Kingdom quite a bit. And for me, this one's an 8 out of 10.
wow. The Call of Duty of board games. That's interesting. Let's definitely talk more about that later. Before that, my review. Yeah, I would say the things I don't like about this game is it feels not that exciting to me on any given turn. The turns are like micro turns in Architects of the West Kingdom to like the nth degree.
Yeah.
You're only ever doing one tiny thing. There's no ability to ever really do more than one tiny little incremental step. And even when you are completing a architect, you're building a well or whatever, it doesn't really feel that great. It just feels kind of like the inevitable culmination of the path you were following. But like other Garfield games I played, I think that the design does a lot of really smart things that makes it merit a spot in a lot of people's collections. Like it plays amazingly, surprisingly well at 2, we learned. And I think it also plays really well and quickly at 5. It's a great gateway game for the worker placement mechanism in a really pure form. And, it might not be the game that is ever going to rise to the top of my list if I have my ideal pictured game night with super enthusiastic board gamers. But it's a game that I definitely get the enjoyment that I come to board games for every time I play them. And it's a game I can play in a lot of different settings with a lot of different people. And for that reason, I came to the same conclusion as you. It's an 8 out of 10 game. Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at. We'll talk about all that a little bit more on the other side. But Brendan, let's talk a little bit more about the game background.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, this is 2018 from Garfield Games. So this is a company run by Shem Phillips, and it's designed by Shem Phillips and S.J. McDonald, who's done other games with Shem Phillips, like the whole West Kingdom trilogy, and also all of the South Tigris games, which have followed this series up. So Architects falls in this West Kingdom trilogy. So it started with Architects of the West Kingdom, was followed in 2019 by Paladins of the West Kingdom, which itself was followed in 2020, kind of like an annualized series like Call of Duty. In 2020 by Viscounts of the West Kingdom. You can actually play, Jake, did you know this? You can play all of these games in a campaign that links the progress between them with this add-on called the Tome Saga.
I did not know that.
So I think that's cool.
That's cool. Yeah, it's interesting.
It's advertised as working for like 2 to 4 or 5 players, but I've heard works better with maybe 2 or 3. So I just thought that was a novel
That's
thing
neat. Yeah,
that they're
I
all
haven't
linked
really
together.
heard about that.
Yeah.
In other
Jake, you have
games.
experience with all 3 of these games.
Yeah,
right?
I played all 3 of them. And also worth mentioning, this is the second trilogy, the first being the North Sea trilogy. We covered Raiders of the North Sea previously on this podcast. So the interesting thing about these games is it feels like Shem Phillips as a designer is going to a heavier and heavier place as it proceeds through the series. Architects is by far the lightest game, which makes a lot of sense, right? If you'd want your entry point into the series to be light, I think Paladins second most into the medium heavy space, and then Viscount feels like medium heavy plus.
Mm-hmm.
I find that I enjoy Architects the most out of them all. I've only played Paladins twice and Viscounts once, so perhaps with more play, more of that depth would emerge as the payoff for the additional rules complexity. But for my money, I think Architects gives me the most bang for my buck in terms of what I'm investing into the game to what I'm getting out of it.
And then mechanically, the games share some of the same footprint, but not totally. But visually, the games share the same language completely. Yeah?
Yeah. So that's one of the nice things about Garfield games is they all share the same iconography. From what I can tell, like I haven't played all the North Sea and I haven't played the new South Tigris game, but the provisions in Architects and the resources, you'll see similar like provisions tokens so that you can always kind of like recognize it. And it does make the game easier to learn as you've kind of like started to learn this like shared iconography language. And then I would say the mechanisms are definitely different, but it feels to me like Shem is treading on like well-worn ground and doing it in a very stylish way.
Yeah.
Like there is a lot of Stone Age in Architects of the West Kingdom, right? You essentially have just a board here with worker placement spots. On your turn, you send a worker to a spot and do the associated action. And I mean, Raiders of the North Sea feels very similarly. And then I think that both games, why they're such a good corollary, is like they have an interesting and kind of like novel twist on that formula. But it's going to be, if you've played a worker placement game before, this one is going to be incredibly easy to pick up.
Yeah, totally. Well, I'm really excited to dive into the deep dive, Jake. Do you think we should?
Let's do it. And before we do, we'll play Brendan's previously recorded rules overview just to give you a better idea of how this game plays, and we'll meet you back on the other side.
Architects of the West Kingdom is a medium-weight worker placement game for 2 to 5 players. Each player begins the game with 20 workers, and each turn players select a worker placement location, there's more than 10 in Architects, and places one of their workers into it, and resolves its action. Outside of a few special locations, there is not worker placement location blocking in Architects of the West Kingdom. Most locations allow players to gain resources, wood, stone, gold, money, and each of these locations typically rewards players for having previous workers in that location. For example, working the forest nets players 1 wood plus 1 additional wood for each worker they already had in that location. Players use these collected resources to take a build action to build buildings, a key way to score victory points in the game, or advance on the cathedral, which nets them a smaller number of points and a random reward of resources and maybe virtue, and more on what virtue means later. Build actions also function as a shared game timer, and only a set number of build actions are available to players each game, meaning there's an incentive to take these actions, but doing so also speeds up the game. Another key mechanism of Architects is worker capture. To simplify, this mechanic allows players to place a worker into the town center and capture all the other players' workers from a location on the board, moving them to their own player board. Later, player may convert these captured workers into coins, and players must take a special action in the guardhouse to get their workers back. Players can also capture their own workers, directly returning them to their available worker pool. Some actions in the game also gain or lose players' virtue. Having lots of virtue at the end of the game can net players some extra points, whereas having too little virtue from taking actions in the black market or pilfering the tax stand will lead to players not being able to contribute towards working on the cathedral and cost them points at the end of the game. Players have to balance taking these strong effects in the black market and pilfering the tax stand without costing themselves too much by losing virtue. Finally, in addition to building cards, a key signpost and strategic enabler in the game, players also have apprentice cards, which lightly modify the personal effect of taking actions at different locations. For example, if a player has the stone cutter, for the remainder of the game they gain 1 additional stone when they take the stone working action. They also provide players with skill tags, carpentry, tiling, and masonry that act as keys to unlock a player's ability to construct buildings that share those tags. For example, if I have, say, the carpentry tag, I might be able to build a shack, and if I didn't have the carpentry tag, I wouldn't be able to use the build action to build that building. After the final build action is taken, each player, including the player that took the final build action, takes an additional turn, and they can take a build action at that point if they'd like, at which point the player with the most points, summing up victory points from buildings, leftover gold or marble, virtue, progress on the cathedral, leftover money, and negative points for unpaid debts and remaining workers in prison, is crowned the victor.
Thank you, Brendan, for that rules overview. We greatly appreciate it. And I know that a lot of people listening do enjoy it to give them a better impression of this game.
Awesome. Let's get into it.
Great.
So let's talk about the type of decision space, right? So this is a dynamic decision space,
Mm,
more or less, but it feels really static because you're
yeah.
always only doing one thing and you have almost all the worker placement spaces available to you. The what you get back from those actions is shifting based on the number of workers that you have in those locations, and sometimes in the black market where blocking can occur, you might have a space available, or you might not. You might have spaces that you won't use at certain times. You don't have any benefit from getting your workers out of prison if you don't have any workers captured. You wouldn't take a build action if you can't build. But for the most part, I would say it is dynamic based on the cards that you have in hand, the buildings that you could have, the spaces that are available, and what you're getting from those spaces. But because everything starts as being available, to me, the game feels more like a static decision space than a lot of games that we cover on the show.
Yeah, right. It's really interesting because I mentioned Stone Age previously, and I feel like a lot of other worker placement games feel more of this waning decision space
Mm-hmm.
because as you play out onto the board, action spaces get taken and therefore not available to you. And there's the exception with the black market and I guess the cathedral space kind of, but not really. But in general, it doesn't really matter if other people are there at all.
Yeah.
So the spaces aren't declining at all, aren't waning in the same way. And yeah, I do think that creates a much more static space. Like I feel like the general feel of it is static, though you do have a supply of workers that is running out, but you just get so many of them
Yeah,
that
you start with 30.
they take forever to run out, and only once or twice over the course of the game do you need to strategically recall some back to your supply,
Yeah.
and it's kind of on you. It's not like that happens automatically when you run out.
Right. No, definitely. And the other thing that maybe feels somewhat waning in nature is the build action, right? The build action is the clock for the game, more or less. And there's only a set number of those actions that can be taken across all players in the game. So you feel a little bit of pressure there as you would in a waning game. But I don't even think that so much feels waning in nature compared to true waning games where the decision space is shrinking and
I
shrinking.
don't think it even, like, including the fact that the game will eventually end, makes sense as a criteria
Factor. Yeah.
because
Because
all
all
games
games
are going
end.
to end. So if that is, then I don't think any game could be truly static.
Yep.
I guess I can. So there is some elements of it, but I think the feel of this game is sort of like managing the flow of the board state, like what you're trying to do, when to recall, when you have enough of a certain resource, and so I mean I think that feel that I get playing this game, which is a little bit hard to characterize. I'm realizing as I'm stumbling to say this. I think a lot of that is defined by the fact that the decision space is mostly static.
Yeah. Yep.
When you say dynamic, what feels waxing to you?
So I think it's technically dynamic because as certain locations build up, what you're getting there has the potential to give more and more, right? When I go to the forest, I get
Right.
1+1 for everyone that's there. So it's not static in that every time that I go to the forest, I always get one. And my potential to get things from the forest is going to increase until someone captures those workers and places them on their own board and maybe later sends them to prison. So for me, that's what makes the decision space a little bit more dynamic. I think also what impacts it is, when you start, so much of what rules your decisions in this game is you're planning around what buildings you're going to build. The cathedral, in a lot of ways, acts as an accelerator to speed up or slow down the game. By building on the cathedral, you're eating up a build action and you're getting a few points, but you're kind of just speeding the game up. But building buildings is really how you're going to score the majority of your points. So you start with not that many buildings in hand. Maybe you'll get a bunch more. That gives you more options, more paths to pursue through the decision space. And as you build them, it's going to shrink down, but you could get more in the late game. And that to me is what makes it feel dynamic. Any given play of this game feels somewhat different.
Okay. I think I figured out what I was trying to say earlier about why this like managing the flow of this game feels like
Mm-hmm.
the quintessential architect's game experience. What I think you have is a very static decision space on a very dynamic board.
Yeah, yeah,
If
sure.
that makes sense, right?
Yeah,
But I think
totally.
like the actual decisions on your turn more or less are always all kind of the same.
Yeah.
But the impact of those decisions necessarily changes over the course of the game as spaces get built up and as your worker supply dwindles.
I think interestingly, that's partially what might make it a little bit of a good entryway game. There's a lot to learn actually right off the bat. Like if I was teaching this to someone who hadn't played a board game before, I think there's a chance someone would feel overwhelmed. But there aren't a lot of elements that there's not elements that necessarily get added midway through the game. Like in Lost Ruins of Arnak, you have new spaces being added to the
Yes.
board that change things. And as long as you could get over that initial teach, the game stays pretty much the same. So you can really make sure everyone's with you, which might take longer than you like, but once you're there, you're there.
Yeah. I actually played this game with my wife and a friend of ours who are not as much board game enthusiasts as you or I, or probably most of the people listening to this podcast. And I did find the teach it's the kind of teach that is gonna make like a non-gamer's eyes glaze over,
Yeah,
right?
yep,
Because you're like
100%.
they have to like sit with you through like 12 different action things that all do something slightly differently. But the actual like mechanisms, like what you do on your turn, could not be any simpler.
Yep.
So once you get into the game, it truly is a game that anyone can play. And I think it could even be the type of game like it stinks because you obviously want to teach all the rules at the beginning because all those options are going to be available to people right from the jump. But it even feels like the kind of game that if like you had to, you're playing with a group that was like, let's just play and we'll figure it out. You like almost could do it,
Yeah.
or you could do it to a point where it's not going to be that horrible of a deal and people just kind of like learn the spaces as people start taking them.
Totally. You could learning play this game very easily.
Yeah.
I think in terms of clarity, for me, I'm not even going to talk about the clarity actually, but then I'm going to back into it as we get to it. This is a game that's a race in which players have control of where the finish line is, and you're trying to time your collection of resources such that you pull yourself to the finish line right at the right time based on the amount of resources that you have, right? So it's like being in a race with everyone, and just when you sneak a little bit ahead, you pull the finish line out in front of everyone. I think that's more or less what this game is. And for clarity, the most important things in terms of your decision space, from what I can tell, having played this game maybe 12 or 15 times, is your decision space, your path through the game are dictated by the buildings that you draw and can build, the resources on them, and the symbols that they cost to build. Those symbols are really important. They function as keys, and you need apprentices. The symbols on the buildings are locks, and apprentices all have those same matching symbols, function as keys. So your buildings and your apprentices together inform your whole strategic path. And I think the game starts off fuzzy because you don't, until you draw some new buildings, until you decide which apprentices to commit to, there's lots of different directions you could go. But once you commit to those things, all of a sudden the decision space comes into pretty clear focus. There's a few points of variability. If you build on the cathedral, you could get a random influx of resources. Maybe you're counting on getting a black market space that someone else blocks you from, so you don't get it. But for the most part, once you've built up your path through the game, once you've drawn those building cards, once you've collected your apprentices committed to those paths, the decision space snaps into focus and you're more so executing. It's a game about finding a path and then pursuing it. It's not a game about tactically switching halfway through. And maybe once in a while, I play the tavern, I get a new apprentice and I try to pivot. But I'm excited to talk about apprentices more because I think those make this game feel less like an engine building game than maybe it looks like it would be at the start. There's no explosion here. It's a
Yeah.
resource collection game, not an engine building game.
That's a good point about the apprentices where I think they can be almost like a trap. You're like in a lot of
Yeah.
games, right? You think you're like building an engine, so you get a couple that help you like produce more wood or whatever, and then you're like, I'll just go heavy on that. And that doesn't actually like get you anything, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Besides like a bunch of wood.
Right.
That's like hard to use or whatever.
Yep.
Yeah, I think the clarity is an interesting one for this game. definitely to your point, by the time you can see the end of the game coming, you can kind of get to a place pretty easily of, I think, like 100% clarity. Like, I need to take
Yeah.
like these four actions in this order of prior. Like, if I have four actions, this is what I'm going to do. If the game ends before that, I like prioritize the things I need to do before the end of the game. So at that point, you're just executing on pre-laid plans, which generally is just going to be like constructing with previously accrued resources.
Yeah.
But before that, I think the decision space can be really, really fuzzy.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of like the skill separation. I actually think this is a game that has a pretty high skill ceiling in comparison to Raiders of the North Sea. I think the skill ceiling in Architects is much higher, and I actually think it's a more interactive game, even though you can't block people because the timing of the end game is so predicated upon what other people are doing. And I actually think, in many cases, the most efficient way to play this game is to just collect a bunch of resources, because once you start collecting resources, right, you're incentivized to keep doing that until you have all you need,
Yep.
because you don't want to like have those workers removed from the space. And then I think the best way to play this game you could hope for would be like to perfectly accrue the resources for like the 6 building cards you're going to build, and then spend 6 turns in a row building them.
Okay, wait, time out.
Yeah.
Remember how we said Azul has the same decision space as Castles of Burgundy?
Yeah.
Architects of the West Kingdom has the same decision space as Ticket to Ride.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty apt comparison,
Boom.
honestly. Yeah, I
Right?
I like that.
The way you play Ticket to Ride is you draw all of the routes that you would ever need. You draw all of the cards you would need, and then the late game is you just put them down. In Architects, you want to collect all the resources, all the potential buildings, and then you want to put them down, and you want to make the best, most efficient use of both of them. There's reasons why you can't do that
Yeah.
within the game, in both games, and
Yeah.
that's what makes it interesting. But that's the game. That's the
Yeah,
decision
I think
space.
you're right, and I think the reason it becomes so fuzzy early on is because there is a way to like interrupt people's plan through like the capture workers action. But if somebody's sitting there with 4 people on the quarry to collect rocks, it's really difficult to know from where you're sitting if they're desperate to get another worker down there so that they'll have 5 more rocks, which is a really efficient use of the action, assuming they'll be able to spend it all, or if that's actually like all the rocks that they're needing right now. So it's difficult to like figure out when the right time to just take a turn to block somebody else's really efficient space is. And also, you have to be like keeping an eye on the cathedral track at all
Yeah.
times to see like when a market reset is coming up, so that you can make sure that you're not like taking negative points from having workers in the prison, or a variety of different things. So like, for a game that is so uninteractive of worker placement and like the traditional blocking people's spaces, I think it's incredibly interactive from sort of, oh, like one step back of trying to know what you should be doing on any given turn is
Yeah.
very much predicated by what your opponents are doing, what they want to be doing, and what the current board setup is.
And I think that's where a lot of this why you're saying this is a higher agency game than Raiders of the North Sea. And I agree. And it's partially because knowing when to capture other players, when to maybe capture yourself is really important, actually. And knowing when it is opportune to make one of those captures and to have it be maybe you can really set another player back, especially I think the brick/gold space. If a player doesn't have a reliable way to get gold in other ways, gold's a really important resource in the game. A capture early there might seem inefficient, but could actually set a player back quite a bit if you know that that's the only resource they need and they have to pursue. And there's little instances like that where you sort of have to just make the assumption that someone is in need of someone and stop them before they have the opportunity of taking a really prime action. Jake, this game ranges, the like average length of a game is around 30 turns or so, it seems like, and you could have like a 25 turn play or like a 35 turn play. And I think it's really interesting because the efficiency of any given action a lot of times varies, one based on how many workers are there, but also varies based on how long the game is. Buying an apprentice gets better if in a longer game than a shorter game, because you get a return on your investment on those apprentices in a longer game versus in a shorter game. The 4 coins it costs to buy an apprentice and a full action, it can be hard to have that be worth complete while unless you really need the symbol. And I think there's, like you said, there's the math of this game is sort of interesting because of the variable end. If this game didn't have a variable end, I would think it's instantaneously a much less interesting game.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And with the apprentices too, it's interesting that they're sort of tied in the same action spot with the blueprints for getting more building types. A lot of times I
Yeah.
feel like the only reason to get an extra apprentice besides when you start with is because then on your next time you go there you'll be able to get the 2 contracts, because I think that space count gives you 1 contract plus an extra contract for every 2 workers you have there. So that can be a pretty efficient kind of combination of moves of getting the apprentice, and then also getting the 2 contracts with the next move. Not to like get too much into strategy or tactics, but I find myself like if less and less using the apprentices as keys. Like I think that for me, I found it perhaps a more efficient route through the game of just building the buildings that I can based on my early apprentice, which would be the one you start with. And you probably often want to get a second one just very early on in the game so you can get the
Mm-hmm.
max benefit of it. Getting apprentice in the mid or late game does nothing good for you.
It's a waste. Yeah.
So if you are in a spot where like I have to get a third apprentice to build a contract, I think you need to think really hard about if that's actually an efficient use of time and resources, when you always have the option, or almost always will have the option, of just using that contract to move up the cathedral track by discarding it
Yep.
instead of building it.
Yeah, I like actually, one of the great things about Raiders is it has the multi-use cards. And this game has just the tiniest hint of that by letting you discard the building cards to build on the cathedral, which is, it's fun because it lets you use them and it allows you to make interesting decisions around which buildings you're going to build or try to build and which you're going to throw towards the cathedral. But Jake, I think that I just want to hammer home the importance that the signposting of the apprentices is funky, because when
Yeah.
I think that's so much why I felt, oh, this game isn't popping for me. Because to me, these apprentices signal like they're your superpowers. Like you're going to get these and you're going to build a whole strategy around the new abilities that you have. And really that it's just like slightly that, but they're not superpowers.
I don't think the game signposts them that much as that's just like our learned behavior from playing
Playing
so many
Raiders.
other board games with
Sure.
like engine building in it, where it feels like by and large, if you can
Yeah.
get something that gives you some passive benefit over the course of the game, that's like always worth doing. And
Yeah.
apprentices in Architects of the West Kingdom are almost a counterpoint to that,
Yeah.
where it
Yeah.
can be good, but you have to have like a really specific reason for why you're doing it, rather than just like, just taking an apprentice because you're going to get an extra rock every time you go to the quarry is
Yeah.
probably not worth your 4 coins unless you know that you really need 4 extra rocks over the course of the game or
Right.
something.
Yep. It's interesting. So that workshop space that lets you get apprentices or buildings is kind of like the broaden your decision space button that you can push, right? It's going to give you more options. And then almost everything else you do, because of the opportunity cost, is kind of like the narrowing your decision space buttons. Because when you take a build action, you're committing. When you take resources, you're committing down a path, right? More or less. Almost always. And I think that it's fun that the game is structured such that those are both the same area, because they function sort of similarly for the needs of the player. And I think it's touches like that that take a game that might feel kind of just like someone said like I want to make a good worker placement game and elevate it. And for me, this really is that. It shows the polish of someone who really knows what they're doing in the worker placement design space.
Yeah. I don't know why I keep coming back to this term, but I think that these Garfield games are just like a very stylish implementation of it. And I think
Mm-hmm.
like the stylish element of Raiders is the place a worker, pick up a worker. And here it is the combination of that sort of increasing value of the
Yeah.
spaces in combination with the
Capture.
capture.
Yeah.
I think that works really well here. But again, to be critical of it, I think it does, that dynamic does create some kind of weird play patterns at times where if I'm like, I played one to the rocks and then I'm going to play a second one to the rocks and then I'm going to play a third one to the rocks. And now when it gets back to my turn, by far the best, most efficient action is to like play
Do
the
it again.
rocks again. And then when it comes back, depending on the cards in my hand, maybe I do it a fifth time,
Yeah.
and that means like you've just spent 5 times around the table just taking the same action, which can feel a little like weird and unexciting. Maybe you're excited because look at all these resources I'm getting so efficiently, but it just creates kind of like a weird thing where like all of a sudden, because of like the micro turn elements of it, your decision space is diminished to, I'm just going to keep hammering this action until somebody says I can't anymore.
Yeah.
And maybe a better action would be a better example would be with the gold and bricks, because the gold actually just gives you straight up victory points every time. Like you could get to a situation where it's like, I'm going to keep doing this because I'm going to get 4 points every turn until
Yep.
somebody captures my workers from the space.
Right. Which is good at getting players to interact, but not interesting from a decision space perspective necessarily.
Right, exactly. It's like it's a game of chicken. That means like you have to continue playing it until the other person blinks. And
Tells
once
you
you
to say
start going
stop.
down one
Yeah.
of those paths, which could happen multiple times in a game, it's kind of like it's just kind of like a funky quirk. And because the game is pretty light and hopefully you're playing with a group that's going really quickly, it might not be that big of a deal. But if you're playing with a group, if you were playing with 5 people, and that could be like 15 or 20 minutes of your life spent just like only taking the quarry action
Yeah.
over and over.
Totally. Yeah, 100%. I think also, Jake, it's you don't have a lot of some games give you a lot of control over the strategy that you pursue, right? The decision space is really open and you have flexibility at least until the game develops to pursue a given strategy. In Architects, that's not really the case. You're very much at the whims of the apprentice that you start with so that you can try to get value out of it and the buildings that you draw. That's really going to inform your path through the game. And that's great because it means that almost every play feels a little different, though it doesn't feel that different because it's such a static decision space. But it also means that from game to game, you can kind of feel strangled by the options you've been given rather than always being able to sort of pick a path and commit to it, which is kind of just a give and take thing, I guess, that games have to go with. And it's if it fits your taste. I think that I wanted the buildings. My first few plays, I was sort of hoping that I would find if I could build up a big hand of buildings, maybe I could see an interesting path between them, right? So like if I build this building, this gives me 2 marble, and then I'll use those 2 marble to do this, and then that building will let me do that. And all of a sudden I could have this, the tacks on the wall with strings, and I'd have my building cards up there, and I'd have this whole interesting chart pathing everything together. And that would link really well with the fact that this game's all about building up, and then playing everything down. But the more I played, the more I realized in practice you get a little bit of that, but it's not quite turned up to the level that I had kind of hoped. And I liked the game, but I almost wish there was a little bit more of that.
Yeah, I think the problem with signposting in this game is less so that you should be building apprentices when often you shouldn't. I think the problem is that it seems like a game that will be strategic
Yeah.
and tactical, but in reality, it's a game that's almost purely just tactical.
Mm.
And the reason you would think it's strategic is because, oh, I'm starting with a unique apprentice power. Oh, I'm starting with 3 buildings that I can start like working towards. But yeah, I think the payoff of those, most of the buildings in this game, the payoff is just points
Yeah.
in one way or another, right? It'll be like you get 6 points for building this, and if you have, the most rocks at
Wood.
the end of the game,
Yeah.
then you'll get another 2 points or whatever. Like this gives you 11 points, but you have to take 3 debt or whatever. Like it's just some type of points, and you can use that to manipulate to make sure you get the best point payoff for those cards. But there's not really like this time I'm going big rock, or this game I'm gonna try and like
Yeah.
go uh black market strategy. Those can be in there, right? Like the game I'm playing right now asynchronously was a game where I started out like taking the quarry action for the first 6 turns in the game. So and now I'm trying to like utilize that efficiency advantage to get the most points I can. I've had other plays this game that did lead me to taking the black market action a lot. And that could be really efficiently just based on the first 2 apprentices I got and some cards I had in my hand to build that kind of synergize with that well. But you certainly can't be picking something to try out this time before you get that initial draft of cards. Though we
Yeah,
should say you are drafting them, so you do have some influence on the tactics you might want to pursue.
which gives you
But
interesting decisions.
yeah,
Yeah,
which gives you interests. But yeah, there's no like I don't think there's very much long term strategy beyond
take the best action available to you on your turn.
take the best action available as and that is going to be predicated by your goals of either building the blueprints in your hand or moving up the cathedral track, which is also a viable winning condition too. Getting to the
Yep.
top of that and just maybe build like 1 or 2 other cards, you're probably in pretty good shape.
Right, because usually if you're doing that, you're snapping up build actions cheaper than
Mm-hmm.
other players could because building the cathedral is a little bit less expensive than the average building in a game. It varies, but you're also usually getting a kickback back. So usually if you focus on the cathedral, you're playing a rush strategy, and if you focus just on buildings, you're playing a slower strategy.
Yeah, and I in my place, I wouldn't say that I have a good sense on one being stronger than the other, or it feels to me like going cathedral or skipping the cathedral entirely and building only buildings, or doing a hybrid can all be perfectly viable. It feels like those
Yeah.
those are all well balanced.
And maybe you'll start doing the cathedral early to kind of build up some resources
Yeah,
and see what makes the most sense. Or maybe you'll focus on buildings first, and then to try to end the game, then you go into, okay, I'm going to hammer the build action and just build the cathedral as quick as I can, because I know I'm not going to be able to build any more buildings, but at least I can get, chip away a few build actions from other players and limit what they can do. We've said, Jake, that apprentices don't inform your strategy a ton. They do, because you have to make use of what you have, but maybe you don't want to pursue new ones. But do you have any that come to mind to you as ones that you like to get to start? And I'll start so you can think about it. I found that the squires, the cards that every time the black market reset, you just get something, are pretty good. Like there's a squire that just gives you marble every time the black market resets. I found that those are really effective because I'm not forced to use any particular actions outside of making sure I use the resources that they give me. Uh, Also, acquiring them early, they give you a virtue. There's similar ones that, like, I think it's called the Gatekeeper, where every time there's a black market reset, you like get to release workers, but it will cost a virtue. So I feel like the Squire, from what it just feels mathematically like maybe a little stronger on average than some of the others. I don't mind starting with the Laborer, the one that just gives you all 3 symbols. Flexibility is king in games, so I like that card. I like the ones that make the King's Storehouse action a little bit stronger. So there's the merchant that lets you pay money, trade a money for stone, or trade a money for 2 clay, or trade a money for 2 wood. I think those ones are pretty fun. They make that King's Storehouse space that lets you convert to virtue or convert to marble even more effective, and they kind of narrow the decision space around getting money and then converting that money, but they seem like they can be fairly effective. So those are some of the ones that have jumped out for me.
Yeah, I think for me, I'd answer that question by saying the ones I don't like are the ones that give you an extra resource by going to a particular resource space. Those just don't feel worth it because you have to take an action to get it, right? And then say I take the one that gives me +1 rock every time I go to the quarry. So I spent an action to get that guy,
And
and I
four
go to the
coins.
quarry with for 4 coins, and I go to the quarry 4 times. I got 4 bonus rocks.
Yeah.
But if instead of going to pick up that apprentice for 4 coins, I just went to the quarry a fifth time, then I would get 5 rocks instead of 4 and save the 4 coins.
Yep.
So the only reason that'd be good is if people are like really being active on the capture space, which is just kind of depends on the game, but it feels like the more we play it, the more people are being more discerning about when to take
Yeah.
people's actions. Like just going there just to like clear 3 workers of somebody's off the board, especially in a game that has more than 2 players,
Yeah.
it feels like that hurts the person who took theirs and it hurts you. So
Right.
you it's almost like, again, another sort of game of chicken where nobody wants to be the person. Somebody's like got 5 of their workers on the gold space, and nobody wants to be the person to take those workers unless you like really needed coins for some reason, because you can convert them into coins. But everybody wants somebody to capture those. You know what I mean? Like if
Right.
I'm playing the game and somebody else captures somebody else is on the board, I'm like, that is a huge win for me, because that
Yeah.
kind of slows down everyone involved in that interaction.
Yep, totally. It seems capturing 3 seems early. On this, it varies by space, but 3 seems early. 4 seems fine. 5, you might as snatch them up. You can't let someone be taking actions with more than 5 workers there. It's just too much efficiency.
Except for, I mean, it depends on the time in the
It
game,
does depend
because
on the time.
like
Yep.
late in the game, if they want more, if they want 6 extra wood or 6 extra
Who cares?
rocks, if they might
Yeah.
not even have the opportunity to build 2 more things.
Yep.
I mean, yeah. So again, you gotta be discerning about. I would say I'm less inclined. For me, 5 feels like the barrier.
Interesting.
Like 4 is almost like probably not, because like with the gold space, like I feel like they already got the advantage, and they can get 2 more gold, but I don't want them to get 3 more gold with one
Yeah.
action,
Yep.
So 5 is like green light go.
Yep. Okay, the capture mechanism, you can also capture your own workers, which puts them directly back into your worker pool. I sort of initially thought, oh, why would I do that? But the more I played, the more I realized, oh, there's just times where that's actually fairly efficient to do. Maybe instead of spending time going to the guardhouse after people have captured your own, you're going to end up using this as a hybrid, taking other players' workers off the board and taking your own workers back in a way that is interesting, makes the decisions compelling, and the game kind of forces you there. Eventually, you're going to run out of workers and you need a way to get them back. The only way you're going to get them back is through the guardhouse or through self capture. So I like that through the course of the game, because of running out of the workers, it forces you to make an interesting
Yeah.
decision and forces you to interact,
And we should
more or less.
say too that if you run out of workers, then your next turn is just reclaiming one single worker. Which there's some discussion in our Discord about this mechanism, and some people really not liking it, because if that happens to you, you've probably just lost the game. It's that punishing, right? So the argument can be made, like, if that's the case, like, just don't let that happen. But and I think the reason it came up was because it's much easier to miss that you just placed your last worker on the board without reclaiming any, when you're playing on Board Game Arena, than when you're playing this game on the table in front of you, and you can just obviously see, oh, if I place this, then I don't have any workers left in my supply.
And
So
everyone at the table would say to you, if you place that, your next turn is just taking it back.
right, you're gonna get, yeah. So it's not like something that can really ever happen if you're paying attention to it and aware of it. But yeah, you absolutely need to, if not before, with that last worker, do something that's going to reclaim your workers. And there are 3 ways to do it: the gathering space, the capture space, capturing your own. If you have any workers that are in the jail, you can get them back for free, or you could pay 5 coins to like get all of your workers out of other people's roundup space, like if they hadn't been
Yeah.
deposited in the jail yet. So there's always going to be, and even if that costs 5 coins, but you can also just like take a debt, I think,
Yeah.
to do it instead. So
And lose virtue.
yeah,
Yeah.
so there will always be a way that you can reclaim multiple workers when you get to down to your last 1 or 2.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about this game has a morality system, Jake. And the all of the marketing copy around this game, like on Board Game Geek, when the little text, the description of the game is kind of pushing this morality system of like, you're going to have to make decisions on if you're willing to take underhanded deals to build the West Kingdom. And I think, I'm not sure that this is fully borne out in the game. Functionally, this works as this sort of, you move up or down a track. You can
Yeah.
gain virtue by building the cathedral. You can lose virtue by moving down. The biggest thing about losing virtue is if you lose too much, you won't be able to build the cathedral anymore. When you take the build action, which can really restrict what you're able to do, especially in the late game if you need to accelerate the game. And it will also eventually make you lose points. taking the black market actions can be very powerful. There's spaces where maybe you'll pay 3 coins and lose a virtue, but gain a marble, a gold, a stone, and a wood, which is really efficient. And I think those make for interesting decisions around when should I be going for these spaces? Is it worth it for my strategy? But I find the morality system overall is a little half baked.
It's interesting. I don't think it's half baked at all from like the mechanics point of view. Like I think it
Sure.
is really
It's very
interesting.
functional.
It's
Yeah.
functional, right? Not only can you not build the cathedral if you get down a certain point, it also can cost you points at the end of the game if you
Yeah.
finish low on the track. And also there's an opportunity to, if you're kind of even below the point where you can't build the cathedral, you can pay less tax when
Tax.
you're doing actions that require taxing, which includes the capture space, includes buying apprentices, it includes the robbing
The tax stand.
the tax depot or whatever, the tax stand. So there's some really fun tactical play that can be had between like going down intentionally so you can get slightly more efficient actions to build things that then bring you up out of the negative points by the end of the game. And that's really cool. Definitely it does not feel like when I'm playing this game, I don't feel like morally torn
No,
between
no.
anything. Right? It doesn't
And I
feel
think
like
that's
I'm
what I mean.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. Like there's especially because it doesn't really interact with like the capturing and jailing people. Like it totally hand waves away. Like in the rule book, the capture thing is like if there's a group of people, they're probably up to no good, so you could just like capture them. It's like okay, so we're arresting like innocent
Workers?
foresters here or
Yeah.
whatever. Like what? And that's totally fine. That's actually virtuous to do that.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I agree. Thematically, it's a little fuzzy, but mechanically, I think it works really well. Though I do think in my plays, it feels like the line of play I outlined, where you start out by going down a bit to get some advantage and then work your way back up, works a lot better than trying to be super virtuous and just like forego the robbing the tax stand, which can get you like 8 or 10 coins in one fell swoop, and a lot of the black market stuff. I've tried to play games where it's like I'm going to try and do the virtue path and get to the top of that track and have that count as like some portion of my points.
Yep.
I haven't been able to get that to work. I'm sure it can be done and there are lines, but I do think it might be rarer that will be the tactically best play.
I've also seen you try to pursue a debt strategy where you're trying to be the one who has the most workers in prison. So you collect these debt cards, or maybe you release your prisoners by taking the debt cards, and then you have other cards that care about the fact that you have debt, or maybe that you're paying off that debt. And that's another one where it feels like in the right game it could work, but doesn't always. Yeah.
I don't think that one worked out super well for
It
me.
didn't in the
And
game we played, yeah.
yeah,
But that's another thing where there are these strategic lines that work sometimes, and that's another thing that in a game can really raise a skill ceiling.
yeah,
Where if there's a path that's not always the right path and sometimes is, that can mean the replayability of your game increases as people try to pursue mastery. So I like that those things are there.
yeah. Me too.
Yeah, it's fun. If you shaved off one of these mechanisms, the game would be way more approachable, but way less interesting as a game to return to. And I feel like for a game of this weight and a game of this investment level, not that it's super high in learning, I want it to be a game that I can return to often and kind of iteratively play, especially with the amount of variability in it. So I think it's all working in the same direction. Like it feels like a cohesive whole in what it's trying to present from mechanically. And I think that that's really impressive for a game with this number of mechanisms.
It feels so similar to Raiders of the North Sea for me. Of it's this kind of like perfect game to play with people who like board games and but don't spend a lot of time with them. I don't think I would introduce either of these games to somebody who is like, I don't know if games are for me. I'm, showing any kind of like hesitancy at all, right? It's not like a true gateway, but if somebody's like,
That
oh,
looks cool.
cool, yeah, like I'm interested in like these games that you have here. Or we should do a game night sometime. And, they're like really new to it. This is like such a perfect one where I think it does have. It's showing some interesting things that games can do, and it's going to impress people, but it's not so overwhelming to as intimidate or make it so people feel like I can't do this
Yep.
when the game is actually going.
Totally. I also, Jake, sort of as a closing thought, will say that to me, Architects of the West Kingdom is the perfect game that's an example of why games can be worker placement games without blocking. Because I don't think so there's a group of people who argue that only games with blocking are worker placement games. And that's just like an ongoing argument that is sort of there, and that these other games are more action selection games or something. And I think that Architects of the West Kingdom is just the perfect example. You can this is a worker placement game. There's no way around that. There's a little bit of blocking in the game, but most of the spaces you can't block. And I can't divorce that in my mind from the fact that this is a worker placement game. You can't block each other. There's other mechanisms that bring texture to the worker placement puzzle that in some games blocking does, right? There's the additive element and the capture element. Those are the wrinkles here, not blocking, and they're different sides of the same worker placement coin. And I think there's room for other people to make new worker placement games that don't use blocking, don't use this additive collection or this capture mechanism, but come up with some other mechanism that's interesting and puts a twist on the worker placement.
Obviously, people have a lot of fun debating categorization. I think that's something we try and
keep our toes out of.
Steer a little clear of, because it's
no fight with me.
It can just be a little pedantic. But I would say it's like worker placement is a form of action selection. If somebody was like, no, this is more an action selection game than worker placement, or I don't classify that, fine.
Yeah.
that doesn't at all impact my ability to play and enjoy this game.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to play more Architects of the West Kingdom.
Yeah, it's one in my collection, and I think I've already expressed over the course of this podcast why I think it has a place in my collection. I think it was in my top 50, actually.
Nice.
Where was it, though? Do I have it?
Well, you're doing that so we don't leave hanging questions.
Number 42.
Nice. Yeah. That's good.
Yeah, I had it higher than Raiders. I think Raiders is, to me, they're close. Raiders is a little bit more exciting. It has these moments of excitement where you have dice rolls that are meaningful.
The core mechanism is more exciting. It's more novel.
Yeah. I think that people I think it's also people are more likely to have a better first play experience with it. But
yeah.
Architects is definitely the one that I'm more excited to return to after playing both about a dozen times.
There's definitely more going on in Architects too.
Yeah.
I would say. I don't want to leave hanging questions. In the past, we may have said that we would explore another game in this series. I own it. You own it. We both have Paladins of the West Kingdom. Do you still have an interest in playing that game, exploring it, Jake? Where are we at with that?
When we talked about it before, I think we were going to try and cover. I think we talked about covering it as the solo game mode.
Yeah.
In particular, I think it could be interesting. I don't know that that's what people come to our podcast for.
Yeah.
We're not really solo gamers.
I don't know. You played Acropolis solo recently.
Yeah, that's right. I liked it.
Nice. That's awesome.
I'm a big solo guy, turns out. I don't know. I would love to hear people's thoughts. Did you enjoy this episode? Do you want to hear more from Garphil? More about Garphil games on this podcast? If so, which ones? Does the solo Paladins experience sound interesting to you? The reason we do it solo is because it's not online, so it's just difficult for us to get enough plays to where we feel like we can sufficiently and accurately give a good deep dive impressions of it. So yeah, why don't we let our listeners sort of decide that for us, and you can weigh in our Discord, which we always link in the description of this podcast, and highly encourage everyone to join and talk to us there. And I think I lost Brendan, so I'll just close out the show and say thank you as always for listening to this week's episode of Decision Space. We want to thank Hembry for our intro and outro music. Reach out, and I hope y'all have a great week. Goodbye.